I'm Peter Adamson, and you're listening to the History of Philosophy podcast, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Secondary Schools, Iberian Scholasticism. In my day job at the LMU in Munich, I often hold lectures in German for large groups of students. I always warn them at the beginning of the semester that my approach to the German language will be somewhat creative, and that in the unlikely event they are bored by the philosophy, they can keep themselves engaged by enjoying my random assignment of grammatical genders to the nouns. But apart from that, my teaching method is pretty traditional. In an age of PowerPoint presentations and hybrid learning environments, I stick with the good old one-page handout. My thinking here is that if the students have a written outline of the lecture's main points, they won't have to take so many notes, so they can focus better on the ideas. Just how old-fashioned is this approach? Well, the same strategy was devised in the middle of the 16th century. In 1561, the Jesuit Geronimo Nadal proposed creating a series of texts that would relieve students from the need to copy out what their lecturers were saying. This would help them to engage more actively and also ensure greater unity of instruction. When this plan came to fruition, the result was a lot more impressive than a few one-page handouts. Indeed, it was among the most remarkable publishing ventures of early modern philosophy, the Coimbra commentaries, named for the Portuguese city of Coimbra, where Jesuits taught in the College of Arts. The course of lectures that was the basis of the commentaries was also offered at the University of Évora, run by the Jesuits since its founding in 1551. The commentaries appeared in 8 volumes from 1592 to 1606 and were devoted to the works of Aristotle. That's right, 14 centuries after the first great Aristotelian commentator, Alexander of Aphrodisias, a millennium after the commentaries of the school of Ammonius in Alexandria, 600 years after the Baghdad school of Christian commentators who wrote in Arabic, and 300 years after the exegetical works of Thomas Aquinas, philosophers were still trying to explain what Aristotle was on about. But with a difference. This being the 16th century, the Coimbra commentators took a humanist approach to the text. They dealt extensively with philological questions, even though the original Greek text was published along with the main text and commentary only in some foreign editions. It doesn't sound like a project that would produce bestsellers, but the commentaries would come out in more than 100 editions and have great resonance in the history of philosophy. To give just one particularly eyebrow-raising, or perhaps beard-stroking example, Karl Marx consulted them when he was working on his doctoral dissertation. The Coimbra project was the fruit of seeds planted on the Iberian Peninsula over several generations. We have here yet another marriage between humanism and scholasticism, comparable to similar partnerships around Europe in this period. We already know about the humanist side of the story from episode 443, and have learned about the scholastic side too with our coverage of the Jesuits and the Thomas Revival in episodes 445 and 446. But there's still some background to fill in, which will prepare us to delve into what is sometimes called the Second Scholastic over the coming weeks. We'll be looking at topics like economic theory, international law, and metaphysics. It would make sense to start with Cardinal Jiménez Cisneros, who was the confessor to Queen Isabel and a leader of the Franciscan reform movement. He founded the University of Alcalá at the turn of the 16th century, establishing chairs for Scotist, nominalist, and Thomist philosophy. He was also a driving force behind humanist efforts devoted to the Bible. With its combination of scholasticism and humanism, Alcalá was an important intellectual center. Ignatius of Loyola studied there, as did such scholastic thinkers as Domingo de Soto and Gabriel Vázquez. On the teaching staff over the coming generations were impressive names like Domingo Bañez and Francisco Suárez. But an even more important city for our story is Salamanca. As I mentioned in the episode on Thomism, the university there was home to the Dominican theologian Francisco de Vitoria. Having himself studied in Paris, learning about Aquinas at the feet of Peter Crocat, Vitoria returned to Spain. There he became the founding father of a group we call the School of Salamanca, which is celebrated especially for its contributions to legal and political theory. This group also included De Soto, Melchor Cano, and Luis de Molina, who studied in Salamanca and then taught at Coimbra and Évora. As we'll be seeing, the intellectual achievements of this group were not inconsiderable, but they'd be worth mentioning just for the role they played in the formation of Francisco Suárez. Originally from Granada, Suarez was another Jesuit who studied law and theology at Salamanca. He taught at various cities in Spain, including Alcalá and Salamanca, before being called to the Jesuit college in Rome and then returning to Salamanca. Finally, he moved to Coimbra, where he taught from 1597 until his retirement in 1613. I apologize for the welter of Iberian scholastics with similar names, teaching at more or less the same cities, but if you remember only one of them, it should be Suarez, who has been hailed both as a culminating figure of scholastic philosophy and as anticipating features of early modern philosophy. We'll have a lot to say about him over the coming episodes. Suarez's itinerary, moving back and forth between Spain, Italy, and Portugal, exemplifies a broader pattern. Just as Vitoria had imported the scholastic agenda of Paris to Salamanca, the scholastic agenda of Salamanca was exported across Europe and beyond. Since Jesuits were so involved in the Portuguese colonial project, their ideas found their way to Asia. I mentioned a while back that Matteo Ricci studied in Coimbra before his exploits in China, and there were efforts to translate the Coimbra commentaries and Suarez's writings on metaphysics into Chinese. Students from Salamanca were also active in the Spanish Empire. Domingo de Salazar, who studied with Vitoria, de Soto, and Cano, traveled to Mexico and became the first bishop of Manila in the Philippines. A close colleague of Vitoria's, Alonso de la Vera Cruz, went to Mexico with 60 crates of books and scientific instruments. And then there was Antonio Rubio, a Jesuit who spent time in Mexico, and after his return to Spain in 1599, published a textbook called Logica Mexicana. As a recent book on the global impact of Salamanca remarks, the city was a hub of knowledge that continuously absorbed knowledge from other areas and integrated it into its own discussions and deliberations, thus adding to the transformation of knowledge. Closer to home, the ambitious undertakings at Coimbra also showed the impact of Salamanca. A Dominican who studied there, Martín de Ledesma, taught at Coimbra from 1540 to 1574, holding the chair that would later be occupied by Suarez. Connections like this created the perfect environment for the writing of those commentaries, but a perfect environment doesn't guarantee perfect execution. The project was at first led by Pedro da Fonseca, who has been called the Portuguese Aristotle for his efforts. Carrying on the tradition of Italian humanists like Argyropoulos and Bessarion, Fonseca sought to bring together refined humanist Latin with Aristotelian philosophy. He would eventually produce a 4-volume commentary on Aristotle's metaphysics, but under his leadership, the project as a whole moved rather slowly. Nowadays, a university might hire a consulting firm to get things back on track, but back in the 16th century, they were more sensible. So instead, a more efficient philosopher was brought in. This was Manuel de Gauche, who especially prioritized natural philosophy. Ever since those scholars of late antique Alexandria, logic had always been the first topic of the curriculum, but the Coimbra team only got around to the logical writings of Aristotle, under the title of Dialectic, in the 8th and final volume. Instead, it was his physics that appeared first in the series. The metaphysics remained a striking absence, perhaps because of Fonseca's own separate commentary on the work. That left most of the volumes, which in total stretch over 3,000 pages, to deal with natural philosophy, which would include the theory of soul, since the commentators considered psychology to fall under natural philosophy in keeping with tradition. The volume devoted to Aristotle's On the Soul was supplemented by a freestanding treatise showing on Aristotelian grounds that the soul can survive without the body, by now a doctrine explicitly endorsed by the Church. But with that exception, the Coimbra commentaries focused heavily on the physical aspects of natural philosophy. This might have something to do with the wider context. The University of Coimbra also had a medical faculty, and some of the students taking philosophy there would have been working towards a degree in medicine. Their interest could explain why the commentators do things like adding a discussion of the anatomy of the eye, based on Vesalius, when they're talking about Aristotle's remarks on the power of sight, even though Aristotle himself has almost nothing to say about the visual organ. A study devoted to these medical aspects of the commentaries concludes that, in Jesuit commentaries, the aim was not just to interpret Aristotle's work, but also to set down a coordinate system for discussions that were of no immediate use for the understanding of the ancient source, but catered to specific, systematic, or encyclopedic concerns. Which is not to say that religious motivations played no role. Explaining the importance of logic, Fonseca remarked that training in dialectic could help people to avoid falling in with the Lutherans, whom he called the heretics of our time. These Iberian schoolmen did not consider themselves to be professional scholars of Aristotelian thought. They studied, taught, and wrote about theology, which is why their greatest authority was the theologian Aquinas, and not, say, the arts master John Buridan, who made great show of restricting himself to logic and natural philosophy. Capturing the counter-Reformation agenda nicely, de Soto drew a close connection between contempt for scholastic method and the swarm of heretical errors. Notwithstanding the influence of humanist techniques in Iberian scholasticism, he also associated knowledge of languages with these two threats, alluding to the destabilizing effects of biblical philology practiced by Erasmus and his imitators. Likewise, Báñez insisted on the reliability of the received Latin translation of the Bible, saying that the supposedly original Hebrew and Greek texts of the Old and New Testament had in fact been subject to extensive corruption over the ages. Given the vagaries of textual transmission, Christians would do better to place their trust in church authority than in the study of classical languages. So, just as with Aquinas, Scotus, or Occam, it would be a distortion to present Vitoria or Suarez as if they were secular-minded philosophers. Yet they did write extensively on what we might call purely philosophical topics. As I say, we'll be looking at several of these in depth soon, but I want to go through some interrelated issues now, just to give you a flavor. Let's first look at how they handled that central debate of medieval scholasticism, the problem of universals. It's been a while since we talked about this, so here's a quick recap. The challenge is to explain what accounts for the similarity of things of the same type, or things that share a common feature. Take, for example, the handouts that I distribute each week to my students. Each of them is printed on white paper. Is there just one thing, whiteness, that is present in every handout? It may seem so, given that it would be natural to say all the handouts are the same color. On the other hand, it's hard to see how just one whiteness could be in all the handouts, since it would have to be in more than one place at a time. Those who say yes to this question count as realists, because they think that the universal white, or whiteness, is something real out in the world, which is somehow found in many things. Of the medieval thinkers who took up this issue, Scotus was the one most known for adopting a realist position, though his realism was of a characteristically nuanced kind. You can go back to episode 263 to hear the whole story. Those who, like Occam and Buridan, said no and denied reality to universals are often called nominalists, since they suggested that the universal is just a name and that everything out in the real world is a particular. In other words, what really exists is this handout, that other handout, and so on, and we use the word white for all of them just to register that they look like each other. Alternatively, one could say that universals are mere concepts in the mind. For scholastic thinkers, a chief disadvantage of these positions was Aristotle's insistence that knowledge is universal in scope. A color scientist doesn't know about this white thing or that white thing, but grasps universal truths about whiteness in general. That was a lot easier to explain for realists, since they could say that scientific knowledge targets a universal or common nature that is part of reality. Nominalists and conceptualists, by contrast, were in the awkward position of having to explain why science is universal in character, even though reality isn't. What's wanted here, then, is a theory that makes whiteness and other universals real enough to be objects of knowledge without being so real that they violate our intuition that everything out in the world is an individual. This is exactly what Suarez aimed to provide. In so doing, he was reacting to other scholastic thinkers, from Aquinas and Scotus right down to more recent schoolmen from Iberia. To make things relatively simple, let's just contrast him to his fellow Coimbra professor, Pedro da Fonseca. Fonseca had the idea of applying Aristotle's famous distinction between potentiality and actuality to the problem of universals. There would be a common whiteness that does not exist fully until it is realized in individual white things, like my handouts. At this stage, it would be merely potential. Then it would become actual as the particular whiteness in a particular white thing. Clever, right? Not according to Suarez. Though he's too polite to mention Fonseca by name, he targets this theory for refutation, insisting that there can be no unity prior to the unity of particulars. He thus accepts the anti-realist view that everything in reality is individual. Nonetheless, we can identify what he calls formal unity between, say, the whiteness in this handout and in that handout. The common whiteness, the one that is formally identical in all the handouts, is nothing but the individual cases of whiteness when they are considered by our reason as being one and the same. This may just sound like a conceptualist solution, The universal or common nature is simply in the mind. But Suarez emphasizes that our minds are, as it were, really onto something when they classify all the cases of whiteness as having formal unity. The handouts are really similar to one another, which gives us a real basis for the judgment that they share something in common. This account of universal or common features allows Suarez to solve to his own satisfaction another long-standing difficulty in scholasticism, the problem of individuation. Here, we are asking not what accounts for the same whiteness being present in all the handouts, but what accounts for the difference between one handout and another. If I bring a stack of 100 handouts to a class, then there are 100 very similar individual pieces of paper in the stack, so similar that you wouldn't be able to tell them apart until the students scribble down further notes on them. Something must explain why we have 100 different things here, despite their similarity or formal unity. A study of this question in later scholasticism praises Suarez in the following terms. His philosophical effort in the area of individuation can be seen only as far superior to anything accomplished before him, and it is not clear that we can find subsequent writers who have surpassed it. Suarez begins from the basic observation that the individual is just what cannot be shared. It is, as he says, incommunicable, like this human, as opposed to just human. If there are other things of the same type, like other handouts that have the same white color, then the individual is distinct from them. But a unique thing, like the sun or moon, can also be an individual, even though it isn't distinct from anything else of the same kind. Now comes the key insight. As we just saw when talking about the problem of universals, individuality is prior to formal unity, to universal or common features. In other words, it's not like we begin with whiteness in general and then have to divide it up and get it into 100 different handouts. Rather, we'd start with 100 different handouts and then notice that each of them is white. Some nominalists, like Occam, thought it was just a brute, unexplained fact that each handout is an individual. Suarez, though, says that each handout is a combination of an individual form and the individual matter it is made of. The matter and form, though, have nothing further that individuates them. And in the case of something that has no matter, like an angel, the thing is just an individual in its own right, without any further explanation. This is indeed a persuasive response to our problem, if one can call it a response. In a sense, it just comes down to denying that there was any problem after all, because metaphysics must start from individuals, rather than starting with something else and trying to explain where individuals might come from. But that leads to another difficulty. According to long-accepted Aristotelian doctrine, the human mind does not grasp particulars. Rather, it works only with universal concepts, which we abstract from our experiences of particulars. To engage with particulars in the first place, we need to use lower powers of the soul, like sensation, imagination, and memory. A major development in Iberian scholasticism, though, is to deny this doctrine, despite the fact that it was endorsed by that leading authority, Thomas Aquinas. A number of thinkers of the time, especially amongst the Jesuits, said that the mind can directly grasp individual things, just like the senses can. Examples include Francisco of Toledo, Juan Maldonado, and of course, Suarez. As we've seen, the intellect does also notice the similarity between particulars, thereby grasping their formal unity, but since that unity is nothing other than the individual unity of the particular things considered from a different angle, it makes perfect sense that the mind must also be grasping particulars. Of course, Suarez insists that he has Aristotle on his side here. When Aristotle states that the mind grasps universals, he must just mean that the mind grasps both particulars and universals, whereas sensation can grasp only particulars. But it is still a decisive move away from the Aristotelian tradition as it came down to the thinkers of the Second Scholastic. With this, we've only scratched the surface of scholasticism in 16th century Spain and Portugal. In fact, there's a lot more to say just about their views on the human soul and how it interacts with the world. So next time, we'll be talking to Anatropia, who is an expert on that particular topic, here on the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps.